Now, in my view, law cannot self-negate in this way. Much of law is marginal or incremental in nature, but unless potential moments of upheaval are latent within it always, law ceases to be responsive to its subjects. Indeed, it ceases to be law in that it no longer represents the self-expressed commitments of an integrated political community. To commit to law is to have the power to remake it. So this suggests a need to reinvigorate environmental law, not in welfarist terms, but in terms of the ethical self-understanding of its authors, us. Now, what would that kind of reinvigoration look like? It's not all that hard to imagine. Like anti-discrimination law, much of environmental law was on a course for foundational, even constitutional significance until a rash of restrictive court interpretations and a changing political context resulted in a downgrade of its power and meaning. Constitutionalism, in this sense, must be envisioned well beyond the four corners of the written text and the halls of the Supreme Court. In some cases, foundational legal change occurs through more diverse, more diffuse mediums, including through movement parties, dramatic shared social experiences, highly symbolized elections, and the passage of landmark statutes, like the Civil Rights Act or the Social Security Act, for that matter. It's difficult to model this as a causal system, but this broader array of constitutional determinants can, under circumstances, come together to enable the proposal, acceptance, and consolidation of a constitutional change just as powerfully as the much more studied formal mechanisms of judicial interpretation and amendment. Might we profitably understand 1970s era federal environmental statutes from this perspective? After all, the environmental movement did model most of its litigation, media, and advocacy strategies on the civil rights movement. Broad acceptance of environmental goals and values within the culture coincided with similarly progressive changes in attitudes toward race and equality. Environmental legislation enjoyed extraordinary bipartisan congressional support in this time. And Richard Nixon's creation of the EPA and his general acceptance of environmental policies seemed to seal the foundational legitimacy of the movement, just as his refusal to oppose the Civil Rights Act helped to signal the ultimate constitutional success of the Second Reconstruction. Also, like federal civil rights legislation, many of the landmark federal environmental statutes seem on their face to aspire to something more dramatic than business as usual lawmaking. For instance, unless you're aware of the subsequent judicial curtailment of the National Environmental Policy Act, you can only read that statute as a deliberate effort to revolutionize the way in which agencies and courts interpret all law, an aspirant to super statute status, if ever there was one. Indeed, though scarcely noted today, the NEPA statute contains language that could be read to confer a proto-constitutional right to environmental protection. Equally ambiguous from this expanded constitutionalist perspective are statutes like the Endangered Species Act, which prohibits not only public but private actors from contributing to species loss. The Clean Water Act, which flatly prohibits degrading high-quality waters irrespective of opportunity cost. The Clean Air Act, which vests far-reaching health-based regulatory power in a federal agency, the full breadth of which we're only now appreciating as EPA tries to implement a greenhouse gas emissions control program following the Supreme Court's ruling. Now, had we, the people, remained popularly committed to the reformist vision that we find in these statutes, and had those statutes been more fully pursued and enforced, then they would not appear to us today to be idealistic or naive in the way commentators describe them to be. That's because the technologies and the knowledges and the values we'd use to assess those statutes would be quite different today. Nor would the statutes be easily dismissed as inefficient or irrational according to cost-benefit analysis, because we'd be unable to ignore that the fact that the statutes tried to alter the underlying economic and informational and technological systems that give rise to cost-benefit values at any isolated moment, rather than simply respond to whatever those values happen to be. So environmental law, in that sense, would neither operate at nor be evaluated at the margins. Instead, it would live within our constitutional conversation. So one way to resume that conversation now, I think, an important way, would be to resist the economist mantra that trade-offs are inevitable. Instead, we should recall that there's nothing inevitable about the manner in which knowledge is organized to create the perception of a need for trade-offs. Indeed, when faced with this mantra, we should always have the impulse to reevaluate the underlying empirical and normative assumptions that drive the appearance of irreconcilable conflicts. We should, for instance, resist the notion that a unitary conception of value, such as willingness to pay, will ever be adequate for our needs. Whatever metric we choose to conduct welfare analysis, the danger arises that it will come to crowd out other ways of conceptualizing well-being, promoting its attainment. Significant questions will be effectively embargoed since the optimizing logic of cost-benefit analysis will attach an efficiency price to any deviation from its norms of evaluation. So instead, we should require our agencies to deploy multiple value metrics whenever they undertake regulatory analysis. The hope would be that this kind of requirement would prompt some serious scrutiny about the merits of competing welfare criteria. Cost-benefit data would then become somewhat denaturalized, especially as it pertains to the existing pattern of right and resource distribution. The politics of stasis associated with cost-benefit analysis would become replaced by a politics of possibility, maybe even a politics of poetry. More broadly, liberal constitutionalism, I think, should view itself always as a work in progress, asymptotically striving toward an unattainable but undeniable goal of universal recognition and respect. Environmental law, in my view, raises questions that simply cannot be subsumed within a cost-benefit framework, questions that I believe haunt the vision of liberal harmony in just the right way. These questions concern the standing of what I call environmental law's others, statistical victims, members of other nations, future generations, non-human life forms. Typically within economics, we value these others only insofar as they're held as objects of value by presently acknowledged members of the cost-benefit community. I don't believe that approach is equal to the challenge. To meet the ethical demand raised by environmental law's others requires more in the way of humility and striving and unflagging self-awareness than it does in scientistic or rationalist rigor. It requires awe at the sheer power of being within history, of being able to influence history by connecting thought to action in a world that's already otherwise connected and that accordingly will react in ways we cannot foresee and often will not desire. Taken to an extreme, that kind of awe would lead us, like Janus, to gingerly step behind broomed surfaces, lest we make moves that cause death even to the insects that lie beyond the reach of our vision. But the basic wisdom, the essential wisdom, is that causing death must always be done with solemnity and with the hope of greater precaution tomorrow. There can be no efficient or optimal level of death. There can only be a commitment always, in Beckett's words, to fail better. Thank you.